Thank you all so much for joining us today. I am so glad to be here with some tremendous experts from the Department of Labor, including Policy Advisor Joe Sweeney, Senior Policy Advisor Manny Lamar, Deputy Solicitor Elena Goldstein, and of course, I'm so glad to have Darlene Lombros, who has been an indispensable partner on these issues, along with um, Chayton Green and Brian Doherty from the Greater Boston Labor Council. My mother is one of five sisters in an immigrant family to Malden. She was the second oldest. The third oldest was my Aunt Catherine. And my Aunt Catherine worked in the wage and hour division for the Department of Labor in Boston for 30 years for the regional director of Wage and Hour. So it was something we heard about every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every Easter at our dining room table. And we just have to make sure that going forward we get these issues right. So together, we're here to discuss how the Inflation Reduction Act is meant to be implemented by workers in good union jobs. And as I speak with all of you today, the need for urgent climate action could not be clearer. The planet is sick, it's making our people sick, and the prescription for what ails us is clear. We need a whole of government approach to address the climate crisis. By passing the Inflation Reduction Act, we have secured the single largest investment in climate and clean energy to date. The investment can lead us to a better future, but only if we get the implementation done right. Otherwise, we risk repeating the injustices of the past. As these federal investments spur new projects and create jobs, we must ensure they are good paying union jobs. That's why many of the clean technology tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act are worth more when developers pay workers a prevailing wage and use registered apprentices. That's not an accident, it's on purpose. These job standards will result in better projects, better policies, better communities. The tax credits that come with pro union provisions, which many of them do, including a credit that came from my Offshore Wind America Manufacturing Act, which supports building and retrofitting factories that make offshore wind technologies in the United States. So there are also pro-union provisions and tax credits for installing renewable energy technologies and for building energy efficiency homes and commercial buildings. Our buildings, our energy, our factories, our future, we cannot create climate safe world if we leave workers behind. We have to create high quality, safe, well paid union jobs and ensure that all Americans have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. We can find an ambitious path forward on climate action, a path forward that will be built by union workers. So I'm ready to stand shoulder to shoulder with you. Together, we can make sure that these programs truly invest in workers in a truly just and climate safe future. And that's why my team is here to help you navigate these resources, whether you're a union member or a company, a municipality, or other project sponsor looking to partner with union labor. And that's why we will continue to work in coordination and solidarity with all of you going forward. So now I'm going to hand it over to Joe Sweeney, policy advisor at the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division. And from age 6 on, I was hearing about the Wage and Hour Division, Joe, at my dinner table in Malden, Massachusetts. And you are truly doing God's work, as are everyone else who are joining us today. So let me turn it over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Senator Markey. I appreciate those kind words as well. Not to disrupt anything too much, but I would actually like to just for these first few slides hand things over to my colleague Manny Lamar with the Employment and Training Administration, and then we will jump right in if that works.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Senator. And thank you for your remarks. They're spot on. What we'll do today is go through the key elements of the Inflation Reduction Act and the implication for prevailing wage and registered apprenticeships. I do want to provide a few quick disclaimer is that as we go through the slide, this deck really provides an overview of the Inflation Reduction Act provisions for general purposes, and it's not itself considered tax advice. The content when we go through the presentation is based on the proposed regulations and other information on irs.gov. And so we do want to also encourage participants to refer to the guidance that's issued by IRS for more detailed information on the rules associated with the IRA. And again, Inflation Reduction Act, I'll be using the term IRA for it. So these convey high-level points. And of course, we want Treasury and the IRS will carefully consider feedback submitted during the public comment period for the proposed regulations before issuing their final rules. If we go to the next slide, and some of the key pieces that Senator mentioned are really important and spot on, which is that a few things. The first thing is that when the president signed the Inflation Reduction Act in August 16, 2022, it really pairs climate investment to the creation of good paying jobs. And really the IRA's unparalleled investments to really fight the climate crisis will really help improve job quality in the clean energy industries and really incentivize the expansion of workforce training pathways into these good jobs. So really the IRA codifies a direct connection between tax and labor code. And so that's why, again, the points Senator made, connects really well to that. And we'll go through, as we go through these slides, we'll highlight specifically the prevailing wage and the registered apprenticeship requirements within the IRA and connect that piece together. On the next slide, and just want to make sure everyone can hear me well. On the next slide, perfect. On the next slide, I'll just start through, which is that after the IRA signed on November 30th, 2022, the Treasury published initial guidance on the IRA's apprenticeship and prevailing wage requirements in Notice 2022-61. So the IRA prevailing wage requirements apply to qualified facilities, projects, property, or equipment for which construction began on or after January 29, 2023. And then on August 30th, 2023, Treasury issued a notice of proposed rulemaking on the IRA's prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. And so that replaced the previous initial guidance. So there's a current public comment period, and it's open for 60 days, and it goes through October 29, 2023. And so Treasury requests that any comments be submitted in writing. So please visit regulations.gov to file and view the public comments. On the next slide, just really quickly, these are the specific, the IRS prevailing wage and apprenticeship provisions apply to these specific 8 tax credits. And in addition, there's 2 additional that the IRS prevailing wage provisions apply to as well. So these are the specific incentives that that applies. And then we'll talk about more of the implication in a second. And then with that, on the next slide, I'll turn it over to my friend and colleague, Joe Sweeney, to get through and dive a little bit deeper on the prevailing wage components.
Thank you very much, Manny. As mentioned, my name is Joe Sweeney. I am a policy advisor with the Wage and Hour Division for the U.S. Department of Labor. Just really briefly, before we dive into the IRA's prevailing wage requirements, I wanted to provide a little bit of background on the Wage and Hour Division and what it is that we do. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So as I think many on this call may be aware, the Wage and Hour Division is responsible for enforcing some of our nation's most comprehensive federal worker protection laws. Those include protections related to the federal minimum wage, overtime pay, child labor requirements, family medical leave, and of course, the prevailing wages for government-funded service and construction contracts. And with the recent passages of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and now the Inflation Reduction Act, the Biden administration is overseeing not only sorely needed investments in our nation's infrastructure, but also, as Manny mentioned, an historic investment into our nation's workforce, one built on prevailing wage labor standards, such as those described in the Davis-Bacon and related acts, and now the Inflation Reduction Act. Next slide, please. So really briefly here, the Davis-Bacon and related acts, as I think a lot of people on this call may know, require the payment of local prevailing wages to construction workers performing work on federally funded or federally assisted construction projects. And the guiding purpose of the DBRA is ultimately to help ensure that the government's extensive construction contracting activity does not have the unintended consequence of depressing workers' wages. And so with that, it's the Wage and Hour Division's responsibility to administer and enforce the Davis-Bacon and related acts, from conducting wage surveys to determine the wage and fringe benefit rates for construction workers on those projects, to enforcing the standards when there are violations. And just really briefly as well, as many folks on this call I'm sure are aware, on August 23rd, the department published the final rule to update regulations that implement the Davis-Bacon and related acts. And this rule is actually scheduled to go into effect October 23rd, which is 60 days after publication. All right, now next slide. With that, we can get into the IRA's prevailing wage requirements. So the IRA prevailing wage provision incentivizes taxpayers to pay prevailing wages or higher to the workers constructing clean energy projects under the Inflation Reduction Act. Under the IRA's NPRM, taxpayers must ensure that any laborers or mechanics employed in the construction, alteration, or repair of any qualified facility be paid at least the prevailing wage for their job classifications. So those can be an electrician or an iron worker or an operating engineer for similar types of construction in the facility's location as determined by the Secretary of Labor. So ultimately, the wages that are being paid are the very same that are set under the Davis-Bacon and related act by the Wage and Hour Division. The proposed regulation also provide details on the statutory cure and penalty provisions intended to ensure timely correction of any issues and incentivize project labor agreements, but we'll discuss that in a little more detail in a few moments. Next slide, please. So a taxpayer that wishes to meet the prevailing wage requirements of the Inflation Reduction Act must ensure, as I mentioned, that the payment of prevailing wage rates for the applicable classification of laborers and mechanics for the construction, alteration, and repair are being done on all parts of the project. These wage rates are ultimately found in wage determinations that are published by the Wage and Hour Division at the United States Department of Labor on sam.gov. Now, in certain instances, the applicable wage determination may not contain a labor classification needed to perform the construction work on a particular project. And in those instances, if anticipated work is not performed by any other classification on the wage determination, the taxpayer should and can request an additional classification for that work from the Wage and Hour Division by emailing the Wage and Hour Division at IRA prevailing wage at dol.gov, and that is also listed both on our Wage and Hour IRA webpage and also in the NPRM. Now, this request should contain all relevant information pertaining to that request. So that includes the type of facility, the facility's location, proposed labor classifications, proposed prevailing wage rates, job descriptions and duties, and any rationale for the proposed labor classifications. Once a taxpayer or contractor has done that, after review, the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division will notify that taxpayer or contractor as to the labor classifications and wage rates to ultimately be used on that project. And let me just say, this is one of the key roles and responsibilities of the Wage and Hour Division in implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. As I mentioned, the wage rates that are ultimately used here are the ones that are set and determined by the Secretary of Labor under the Davis-Bacon and related acts, and similar to the Davis-Bacon and related acts system, any type of issues with wage determinations, labor classifications, and wage rates are something that is going to be handled ultimately by the Wage and Hour Division at the United States Department of Labor. We go to the next slide, please. So another common question that we at the Wage and Hour Division have gotten is the Inflation Reduction Act a Davis-Bacon related act? And let me just start by saying it is not. The Inflation Reduction Act is not a traditional Davis-Bacon related act like the CHIPS and Science Act and like much of the funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law. So any taxpayer or contractor subject solely to the labor standards in the IRA are not automatically subject to the regulations implementing the Davis-Bacon Act and related acts, including regulations related to enforcement. However, IRS guidance implementing the Inflation Reduction Act does in fact incorporate, as you've heard, certain Davis-Bacon concepts and requirements, such as definitions of the site of the work, construction, alteration, or repair, that are both relevant to implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act's prevailing wage requirements and are also commonplace in the DBRA programs. But it's very important to remember that the Inflation Reduction Act's prevailing wage requirements are implemented through guidance issued by the IRS, currently, as Manny mentioned, the NPRM that's out there, and not implemented through the Davis-Bacon and related act implementing regulations. With that, I will turn things back over to my colleague Manny Lamar to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act's apprenticeship requirements. Manny?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joe. Again, Manny Lamar, Senior Policy Advisor at ETA, which stands for the Employment and Training Administration. And we focus on high quality job training, employment, income assistance, and labor market information. And within ETA sits the Office of Apprenticeship. And so really, if we go to the next slide, I do want to kind of set the context on the apprenticeship component by saying a few things, which is that, through the Inflation Reduction Act, it really helps fulfills the department's commitment around good jobs and equitable opportunities for all workers, ensuring that as we build the economy, this clean energy economy, as we address climate change, that we're thinking strategically and inclusively to ensure that all workers are able to participate in this labor market. So it really also drives the goals of expansion and quality when we're talking about registered apprenticeships across the board. And then the other thing is that it really kind of enhances the opportunities for us to collaborate in greater collaboration with our state apprenticeship agencies. And then the final thing is really continuing to promote that awareness and greater promotion of the registered apprenticeship system. So through the IRA, we hope to continue those expansion goals and maintain quality through the registered apprenticeship system. On the next slide here is where I'll dive specifically a bit more on what are the key requirements or the key components within registered apprenticeships. As Joe mentioned, under the new rules enacted by the IRA, taxpayers, and that includes contractors or subcontractors, they must employ qualified apprentice for work on any qualified facilities to receive those enhanced tax credit. And those tax credit gets enhanced 5 times by leveraging the prevailing wage and the registered apprenticeship requirement, particularly on certain number on the registered apprenticeship requirements. Now, there are key components with the registered apprenticeship requirements that I'll go through. The first thing is a qualified apprentice. And really what that means is that it's someone who's participated in the registered apprenticeship system, where that is recognized through the Office of Apprenticeship, the U.S. Department of Labor, or a state apprenticeship agency. So that apprentice has to be a bona fide apprentice through an SAA, state apprenticeship agency, or the USDOL's Office of Apprenticeship. Now, once you have the apprentice, there's 3 specific requirements. The first one is around labor hour requirement. And what that means is that there's a minimum percentage of labor hours of the construction, alteration, or repair work, including work performed by contractors or subcontractors. It has to be performed by a qualified apprentice. So that's really what it is. For a certain number, the labor hour is about apprentice performing a certain amount of the work. And escalating percentages goes from 12.5% for projects beginning in 2023, and then 15% for that's for projects starting in 2024. So that's the labor hour requirement. The second one is the ratio requirement. And really what the ratio requirement is about is really about ensuring that there's sufficient experienced workers to oversee the apprentice. And again, that's one of the marquee principles of a high quality apprenticeship, is that it includes apprentices are supported by these journey workers or mentors on the site. So the ratio requirement really speaks to that the labor hour requirement is subject to any applicable apprentice to journey worker ratios that is set by DOL or the SAA. The third component is a participation requirement. And here is that each taxpayer, again, including contractors or subcontractors, employs 4 or more workers to perform construction, alteration, or repair work on a qualified facility must employ at least one registered apprentice. Sorry. So those are the key components: the labor hour requirement, the ratio requirement, and the participation requirement. On the next slide, there's a additional section on some statutory exceptions, and there's a few components there, which is there's a good faith exception. And for the good faith exception, a taxpayer is deemed to satisfy the apprentice requirement if a request for apprentice is made to a registered apprenticeship program and 2 things are met, one of 2 things can be met. One is such request is denied, so their request is denied, but it's not because of a refusal of the taxpayer or the contractor to actually comply with what the registered apprenticeship standards are of the requirement. So a taxpayer can't it can't be because of they refuse to comply with the apprenticeship requirements. And then, or the registered apprenticeship programs fails to comply or respond to such a request. So those are the 2 good faith exceptions. Now, there is an ability to cure, and that component is really about addressing if those aren't met. And a taxpayer that fails to comply with the labor hour requirement or the participation requirement, they have an ability to cure such failures by paying the IRS penalty equal to $50 multiplied by the total labor hours for which the requirements were not satisfied with respect to the construction, alteration, or repair work on any of the qualified facility. Now, the penalty may increase by $500 times the labor hours in the case of an intentional disregard if the taxpayer don't meet that. The final thing on the next slide that I'll mention, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague Elena, is that this just goes a bit more specific into that if for the apprentice to journey worker ratio, that again, one, that they must follow the ratio requirements to claim the labor hours, that they must follow the ratio requirement to claim the labor hours for the registered apprentice. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Elena.
Thanks so much, Manny. My name is Elena Goldstein, and I am the Deputy Solicitor. And thank you to the Senator for having me as well. So I'm just going to briefly talk about what happens if there is a failure to pay what happens and what can tax. So as folks are, I'm sure, aware of the challenges in the IRA space is making sure that folks who are taking advantage of these credits are actually, please let me know if they're having trouble hearing, are actually complying with the prevailing wage and the registered apprenticeship provisions. There will be a time lag, as we're aware, between actually performing the work on the project and claiming the tax credit. And as Joe made clear earlier, unlike a Davis-Bacon Act or related act, the Department of Labor does not have the authority or jurisdiction here to actually conduct investigations or do enforcement work. So the notice of proposed rulemaking provides a number of different incentives that are designed to really incentivize compliance here. And the first thing I'll talk about are some of the penalty structures that are proposed by the notice of proposed rulemaking. So if a taxpayer fails to pay the prevailing wage, they can still claim the tax credit so long as they cure the violation. And this is similar as to what Manny outlined in the registered apprenticeship space. But a taxpayer must, in order to make this cure payment in the prevailing wage space, pay a correction penalty, basically what is owed to the worker, the difference between what was paid and what was owed, as well as interest, as well as paying a penalty of $5,000 per worker who was not paid the prevailing wage at any time during that year. There's also a de minimis exception that this slide outlines, and that's really designed for taxpayers who notice an error that is relatively small and pays that error quickly, the shortest of either within 30 days of learning of the error or of claiming the tax credit. One thing that is, I think, incredibly important in the notice of proposed rulemaking is there is a structure that is proposed that would allow a taxpayer in a project to avoid penalties if they use a project labor agreement. And I know that Ms. Lambos will speak more about project labor agreements or PLAs more after me, but I'm just going to say a few words about how they fit into the structure of the IRA in the NPRM. So as folks know, PLAs are pre-hire collective bargaining agreements that are negotiated between one or more construction unions and one or more construction employers that establish the terms or conditions for a specific construction project. And folks know that PLAs help contractors comply with registered apprenticeship and prevailing wage provisions. They also provide a host of economic benefits and help to build good jobs. And so the IRA provides that where a project utilizes a qualifying project labor agreement and ensures that wages are properly paid by the time they file for a tax credit, the IRS will use its discretion to waive any applicable penalties. So what this PLA provision does is it can provide certainty and a clear path to obtaining the credit for taxpayers who are availing themselves of PLAs. Next slide, please. So if folks do not use a PLA and an underpayment is not de minimis or really small, they will owe penalties. And the same goes, as Manny made clear, for the registered apprenticeship space. But these penalties increase substantially if the IRS finds that failure is due to intentional disregard. So in the prevailing wage space, that correction payment, the difference between what was paid and what was actually owed to workers, multiplies by 3. The penalty to the IRS doubles. It goes from $5,000 per worker to $10,000 per worker. And there's a similar structure in place for increasing those penalties if a failure in the registered apprenticeship space is due to intentional disregard. As you'll see from the NPRM, it also proposes a framework around intentional disregard that incentivizes compliance and contemporaneous or quick payment of wages. So the IRS has said that they will evaluate the facts and circumstances to determine whether or not a failure to pay prevailing wages or comply with the apprenticeship provisions is because of intentional disregard. And they include a whole bunch of factors that the IRS will look at. Things like, was there a wage determination notice posted? Is there a hotline that the employer has established where folks can complain if they haven't been paid appropriate wages without fear of retaliation? Has the employer done audits or monitoring to make sure that wages are being paid appropriately? Basically, the mechanisms that we see in the Davis-Bacon world that tend to be good practices for ensuring compliance. There's also a rebuttable presumption that provides that if you pay all the wages that you are owed before an audit, before the IRS comes and looks more closely, that there will be a rebuttable presumption of no intentional disregard. Again, these are issues that the IRS is inviting comment on. So I do encourage folks, if you have views as to how these can be made stronger for labor or for employers, to go ahead and reach out to the IRS on that. And with that, I will turn it back over to, I believe Manny is next.
Thank you, Elena. On the next slide here, a few things I'll highlight on this. One is around the good faith exception, continuing a little bit. And I think, I'll emphasize this here, which is that, it's the process for submitting the request for the qualified apprentice, that it has to be a few things. One, at least one registered apprenticeship program, which has a geographic scope of operation that includes the location of the facility, or to a registered apprenticeship program that can reasonably be expected to actually provide the apprentice to the location of the facility, and that it trains in the occupations needed to perform construction, alteration, or repair with respect to the facility. And it also has a usual and customary practice of entering into an agreement. And so that is the key components of the request. Now, just really briefly around some of the contents of the request. And again, further information is provided within the guidance, but the request that is made must include the proposed date of employment, the occupations, the apprentice needed, location of the work, that needs to be performed and the number of apprentices needed as part of that request. The number of labor hours to be performed, again, and then the name and contact of the person of the information of the taxpayer, contractor, or subcontractor requesting the apprentice. Additionally, the request must also state that for the apprentice is made with the intent to employ the apprentices in the occupation. So it's not just submitting their request, but it's with the intent of employing the apprentice within the occupations and in accordance with the program standards in the registered apprenticeship program. Now, another component is the duration of the request. So when the request is made, it's for 120 days. So the taxpayer will be deemed to have exercised a good faith with respect to the request for a period of 120 days from the date of the request. Then the taxpayer will not be deemed to have exercised a good faith effort beyond 120 days of a previously denied request unless the taxpayer resubmits an additional request. On the next slide, the main thing here to highlight is that, again, and I mentioned it earlier, which is that the denial of the request can't be because the taxpayer don't want to satisfy the apprenticeship program requirements. And then again, the denial of the request is only valid for the purposes of establishing a good faith with respect to the portions of the request that were denied. And then one other thing, which is that the failure to respond. So again, if the registered apprenticeship program fails to respond to a request submitted within 5 business days after the date on which the registered apprenticeship program received the taxpayer's request, then the request is deemed to be denied. And of course, the acknowledgement, whether in writing or otherwise, by the apprenticeship program of receipts of such requests submitted in accordance with the proposed rule is sufficient response. Now, on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit just briefly about the record keeping under the IRA. And here is just really that the taxpayers must maintain and preserve records sufficient to demonstrate compliance with the applicable prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirement. And then there's some specific instances to keep in mind or to keep for the record keeping. So at a minimum, these records can include payroll records for each laborer and mechanic, including each qualified apprentice employed by the taxpayer, contractor, or subcontractor in the construction, alteration, or repair of the qualified facility. I'll turn it over to Joe on the records for prevailing wage. The next slide.
Thank you, Manny. Yes, so with regard to the prevailing wage record keeping responsibility specifically, these records include payroll records that reflect the hours worked in each classification. So each labor classification, again, whether that be an iron worker, an electrician, an operator, a carpenter, or the like. So each labor classification. And the actual wages and fringe benefits paid to each labor mechanic performing that construction, alteration, or repair work on the facility. So these records could ultimately include identifying information such as the name, social, or other tax identification number of the employee, the location and type of the qualified facility, the labor classifications that were used on the qualified facility, the hourly wages, and including fringe benefits that were paid to the employees on those qualified facilities, and as well as any records to support any contributions irrevocably made on behalf of a laborer mechanic to a trustee or third-party person pursuant to a bona fide fringe benefit program. This is very common to what you see under the Davis-Bacon and Related Act regime in the federal contracting space as well. Those are the types of records, and those are the types of proofs you would need to prove out that fringe benefits were in fact paid on behalf of certain employees. Additionally, the total number of labor hours worked per pay period, the total wages paid each pay period, and really any other records that are needed to also support any apprentices that were used on the job site where the employer paid the apprentice something less than the prevailing wage rate in accordance with the IRA and PRM as well. And ultimately, as well as Elena mentioned, any amount and the timing of any correction payments and documentation reflecting the calculation of those correction payments that were made prior to any type of IRS action. So again, going back to making sure that those correction payments are made in the first instance, hopefully, but before the filing is made and those records are submitted, or records are maintained rather. And as Manny mentioned, these records should be maintained both for the life of the project, but for some time after the project as well, just in case there is any IRS audit ultimately seeks to ultimately have the taxpayer or contractor or subs produce those records during an enforcement action. And then I will hand it back over to Manny as well.
Sounds good. Thanks, Joe. On the next slide here, I'll just quickly mention on the apprenticeship requirement in terms of the records, a few things really quickly. The first thing is just, of course, any written request that is made to a state apprenticeship agency or DOL's Office of Apprenticeship should be maintained, as well as any program standards, registered apprenticeship agreements, particularly documents within the program standards in the agreement that highlights the ratio, the applicable ratio requirement prescribed by each apprenticeship program for which the taxpayer, contractor, or subcontractor employs the apprentice. Additionally, the total number of labor hours worked by the apprentice and the records reflecting the daily ratio of apprentice to generating workers. So just really quickly in summary, the program standards, the apprenticeship agreements, requests made to SAA or USDOL, and documents around the labor hours worked for the apprentice. Now, on the next slide here, I'll just close out by saying, by sharing some resources across the board. So one is a set of resources for Treasury NPRM quick links. And up top is, of course, a publication of the NPRM. There's also links for the prevailing wage and apprenticeship components. There's FAQs from Treasury that is also published, as well as prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements landing page from the IRS. So all of those resources are available online. And then the next slide, I'll just highlight a few DOL specific resources. DOL also has a landing page with information on the IRA. We also include resources for prevailing wage, and as well as a landing page on apprenticeship as well that highlights components around the registered apprenticeship system. And with that, I'll close and turn it over back to the Senator's office.
Thank you so much to Manny, Joe, Elena, and everyone at DOL who helped coordinate this really important information on compliance with the IRA. I'd also like to thank Principal Deputy Administrator Jessica Lumen of the Wage and Hour Division for logging in and joining us. We're now going to pass it over to Darlene Lambos with the Greater Boston Labor Council to speak about the importance of partnering with our labor unions and executing PLAs in doing IRA projects. Darlene, over to you.
Okay, let me see if I can get this working. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, I'm not sure if
Yes,
you
we
can see
can. There you are.
Okay, hi, my name is Darlene Lambos, and I'm the principal officer at the Greater Boston Labor Council. So we represent over 100,000 union members and their families in Greater Boston. I apologize for the noise if there is any. I'm stepping out of a conference to do this important webinar with our labor champion, Senator Markey. We want to just appreciate his leadership on making sure that there are union pathways for women and people of color in environmental justice communities, which is the promise that we've been talking about together for decades, Senator Markey. So I really appreciate your leadership here. And you're not only fighting for us over there in DC, You're also in the streets with us, literally marching with us with SAG-AFTRA on Labor Day. So we want to thank you for that. That was a lot of fun. So mostly why I'm here is to talk about how important it is to partner with labor, that we're ready, we're able, we're willing, to make sure that that promise that happens on the federal level actually happens on the ground. And for us, project labor agreements, you heard a little bit from Elena, which I'm so glad you got a chance to hear from her about what the benefits are from project labor agreements, to ensure that there's access to good career opportunities. So what we've been doing here on the ground is making sure that our municipalities and our elected officials here understand how important it is, if we want to reach our racial justice goals, that project labor agreements are exactly the way in which we can make sure that diversity, equity, inclusion are at the center of all of this work, of all of the infrastructure funds that are coming into our communities, and that we're so excited to be able to partner. And in particular, what we're trying to do is ensure that a union apprenticeship programs are disrupting the way in which some of our communities, unfortunately, have had to deal with in terms of the workforce development model, which is more of a train and pray model, which is there are agencies and nonprofits and well-meaning will give us an opportunity to train on a specific job, but then give us a certificate, and then we're having to go search for that job. Whereas union apprenticeship programs provide a pathway that have relationships with employers directly and ensure that there are choices and union pathways and careers with good benefits and wages, and ensure that we are actually making sure that we are having investments in our communities that are deep and that are broad and not just for specific jobs. So I'd like to actually turn it over to Shaitan Green. I've learned so much from him and all of our sisters and brothers in the building trades unions who have really reiterated the importance of how project labor agreements actually get us to where we want in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and to ensure that we all know that racial justice and economic justice are inextricably linked. So I will turn it over to Shaitan.
Hello, thank you, Darlene. Can everyone hear me? Okay. My name is Shaitan Green. I'm a Boston resident. I'm also the business agent for the Boston Building Trades Unions. My career started from a PLA. I'm a direct benefit of a PLA, graduating from a Building Pathways pre-apprenticeship program, which introduced me to different trades, different wages, and different benefits that I would receive upon entering an apprenticeship, which I did in 2014. I was introduced to local 550 sprinkler fitters trade, and which it intrigued me because it was a trade I never heard of. And as soon as I was educated about how it was a life safety trade, and I would be installing life safety systems, my first job was actually at UMass Boston, which was a project labor agreement site, which I benefited from being a pathway graduate, and also started my career as a first-year apprentice. It was because of that job specifically that I was able to start a career and work in the city that I live in. And also, it allowed me to be able to afford to raise a family in the city that I live in. And it's because of the safety, it's because of the training, it's because people in my community will have access as a requirement of these PLAs on these sites. And I speak for everyone because you can enter into these trades through these apprenticeship programs not knowing anything. And day one, you'll be introduced to different curriculums. You will be paired with different journeymen, and you'll be able to learn different aspects of a trade that you'll spend a lifetime, building your retirement. And I feel like everyone needs access to these life-changing careers, having the healthcare and dental and passing that on to your family as well is so crucial. So yeah, I'm just here to spread the good word that anyone can do these jobs, no matter what color, no matter what gender. These jobs are for anybody who wants them. and it's through apprenticeship programs that make it possible for somebody to go from not knowing to being a master of their trade. So thank you.